O divine healer, we confess that sometimes we yearn for you to wave a magic wand on our wounded lives, to remove our pain, illness, and suffering. We hear the gospel story of the one seeking healing from Jesus and assume you will perform a similar miracle for all of us if we just pray hard enough. And we do pray. Open our eyes to recognize the teachings and tools you have given us with which to seek healing in the midst of our afflictions and diseases. You whisper to us that wholeness requires self-care and rest. You nudge us toward caregivers who can support and advise us. You breathe into us energy to move and stretch and reach toward health. You place in us an urgency to seek justice so that all may enjoy adequate health, care. Renew our spirits in the midst of our diseases and afflicting spirits. Transform us, O Holy One, for the health of your creation. Amen.
Yes, we do seek healing, don't we? And thankfully, we have a healing community to help us on that journey. Today, we're going to see and read and participate in a story that talks about healing. Jesus heals and he reinstates back into a healing community. Well, we're kind of at the beginning of a season in our liturgical calendar, our worship calendar, called Ordinary Time, which begins with or right after Pentecost. We have big days on the calendar, right? Christmas and Advent that leads up to it. We have Easter and Lent that leads up to it. Epiphany, Transfiguration Sunday, Pentecost, things like that. But we're in this season where we don't have any of the big celebrations. It's called Ordinary Time. And it's not called Ordinary Time because it's ordinary. As a matter of fact, we're going to see as we go through the next number of weeks, as we go through the life and teachings of Jesus, there is nothing ordinary about him. There's nothing ordinary about our relationship with him. Why is it called Ordinary Time? The word ordinary, as used here, comes from the term or the phrase ordinal numbers, by which the weeks are identified or counted. Right? We have cardinal numbers and ordinal numbers. So this is a little side teaching, a little bonus. The difference between cardinal numbers and ordinal numbers. Cardinal numbers is when you count something off, or you're counting something. 1, 2, 3, 4 bananas. 1, 2, 3, 4 cups of coffee that Seth will have in the next half hour. If I'm counting people in the back row on the chairs, we'll just use the recliners. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's cardinal numbers. Ordinal numbers represent position in a sequential order. First, Leah's first. Second, third, fourth, fifth. So that's kind of the difference between cardinal numbers and ordinal numbers. We are in the 7th, if I'm not mistaken, the 7th week after Pentecost in Ordinary Time. Enough of that. But after Pentecost, after hearing Peter's Pentecost sermon, the response was by the people, what now do we do? What do we do? And this is the cry of ordinary time, a time we focus on our participation with Jesus and all that he is doing. And what will we find Jesus doing in our text today? Ordinary time brings attention to the call of discipleship, what we're called to do, who we're called to be. Ordinary time helps us develop healthy rhythms of discipleship, worshiping together, serving the neighborhood, being present in our church communities, representing Jesus at work, at home, and among our neighbors. If you remember, and probably not, based on what Ann said about pastors' sermons, if you remember last year during this season, we spent time in the book of Matthew covering the parables of Jesus. Those texts were on the Revised Common Lectionary, a lot of parables, especially in the book of Matthew. This year, we will spend the majority of our time during ordinary time in the book of Mark. It makes sense. Matthew comes first, my older twin brother, and now Mark. We'll do a little side trip into the book of John, I think, for 3 or 4 weeks, and then we get back into Mark as we lead toward Thanksgiving and Advent. We'll be looking at the life and teachings of Jesus, and what better way to deepen our discipleship than learning from the one we are to be discipling ourselves after. Today, at the beginning of our text, and we won't go there just yet, I kind of want to set it up, but at the beginning of the text, we find Jesus back in the boat. He's back in the boat, back on the water. He's racking up some serious frequent floating miles. I mean, he's just really in the boat a lot. Remember, he was in Capernaum and went to the region of the Gerasenes. And some manuscripts, your text may say the Gadarenes. Gadarenes, Gerasenes, potato, tomato, tomato. Actually, if you look at a map, they can be kind of two different places, but in the same region. Capernaum on the Jewish side of the lake, and the Gerasenes or the Gadarenes on the Gentile side of the lake. He left the Jewish side and went to the Gentile side. And remember, Jews and Gentiles didn't mix very well back in the day, or even today, sadly. While on the way, a ferocious squall comes upon the flotilla, the armada of boats. Because remember, there were other boats. It wasn't just the one boat with Jesus and the disciples in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, in the middle of the lake. A ferocious squall comes, and Jesus announces, proclaims, inserts peace in the middle of the lake. He tells the chaos, the tumult of the wind and water to be still. You remember on the Jewish side of the lake, he's teaching and healing, and there's such a crowd of people that he gets into the boats and he goes to the other side. And there he and the disciples are confronted with a man who is possessed by demons. And he casts out the demons, and he brought peace to the man. After all the commotions, because if you remember, we didn't really cover this text, but he sent the demons, or the demons requested, send us into the pigs. And so the pigs ran off a cliff into the sea. And the people came running to see what the commotion was, and they looked and saw that this once crazy wild man, who before didn't have any clothes on, is now fully dressed and in his right mind. Jesus restores him to wholeness. He brought peace to the man. Then Jesus and the disciples left and crossed back over to the other side. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. back to the Jewish side. Here we're going to see that he heals a woman and raises the dead daughter of a synagogue leader. And I don't think I'm giving anything away. Some of you, if you read the announcement bulletin on email, perhaps you read the text beforehand, or you already know the story. So I don't think I'm giving anything away. He's healing and restoring people to wholeness, reinstating people into community on both sides of the lake, whether it's Jew or Gentile. And the way Mark weaves the stories together leaves the impression that what Jesus does in the middle of the sea between the two shores of the Gentile and Jewish territories will be carried out. This peace will be carried out on both shores. God does not choose one shore over the other. The peace he pronounces that calms the storm in the middle of the sea will ripple out to both sides, to both shores. We'll see that the two that he restores in today's text represent two shores, if you will, opposite ends of social, cultural, and the religious spectrum. His touch extends beyond shores, beyond boundaries, beyond class and status and constructed divides. Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through 43. Somewhat of a lengthy text, but we'll be breaking it up into pieces as we go and seeing what Jesus has for us today. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, and say, which side did he cross over to? So he was in the region of the Gerasenes, and he's coming back to the other side of the lake, back to most likely Capernaum. A large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. I get this vision in my head that they'd never left in the first place while he was gone. They were just waiting for him to come back. And then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded. The word here is probably better translated begged. And I did a little, not so much a word study, but looking, and even the demons begged Jesus, and there are people who beg this term, this pleading, begged Jesus. And usually you're at your wit's end when you beg. And this synagogue leader is in that place. He earnestly pleaded with him. He begged him, or with him, and he said, Jairus said, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her. Touch her, so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. I love the simplicity of that. No question, no request for backstory or Jairus, what is, what are your intentions? I mean, his intentions were obvious. Please heal my daughter. But Jesus went with him. Jairus is a synagogue leader, a person of importance, respected. He's the glue that holds this cultural, religious, social community together. And the cultural and the social and the religious, especially in ancient Near East and the Jewish community, it is very much intermingled. He's kind of like the glue that holds that together. And in a sense, he represents the temple, the religious structure and laws. Already we see that the religious leaders from Jerusalem are already plotting to kill Jesus. We see that, I believe it's in Mark 3. They're already plotting to kill him. As a leader of a synagogue, a religious leader, is Jairus a part of this group? What are his thoughts about Jesus? Is he a part of this group? Is he laying that aside out of desperation? Or is he different? Does he believe that just a touch from Jesus will heal her? We don't know much about Jairus and his thoughts, his position on this man named Jesus. But whatever the case, there is something in him compelling him to fall at the feet of Jesus. Next slide. A large crowd followed and pressed around him. We already know that there is a large crowd here, and now we have this scene. A synagogue leader throwing himself at the feet of Jesus, making this request. And you can imagine that this probably piqued a lot of interest with the people. What is Jesus going to do? What is Jesus going to do? They followed and pressed around him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. We're going to see that she's, in a sense, destitute in a number of ways. One of the ways is that whatever money she had spent it all on trying to get well. 12 years. It's a long time. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. We see this earlier in the book of Mark, when people hear that Jesus can heal, that there are people who crowd around him just hoping to touch his clothing, touch his cloak, to be healed. If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. And when she does make that contact, that touch, immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. You can imagine if you have any kind of loss of blood, any kind of hemorrhaging, you're weak, right? That's why after you give blood, they say, don't stand up too fast. Go to the canteen and get some crackers or a butternut. No, not butternut. Yeah, butternut cookies. Those are my favorite. Or fig Newton or something, and drink some water or some juice, because when you give blood, you become weaker. But she felt strong. She felt more full of life. She felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. Next slide. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him, and he turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" Now, it's not the point of my sermon to get into any of the spiritual, metaphysical force leaving the body, or even, did Jesus really not know who touched him? This is Jesus, where it's already been said he knew the hearts of the religious leaders. He knew what they were thinking. How can Jesus not know who touched him? Maybe he was doing something else here. And his disciples kind of chided him. What do you mean, Jesus? Who touched you? I just touched you. John just touched you. James bumped into you. Andrew almost knocked you over. And all these people are here, and you ask, who touched me? We all touched you. What are you talking about? But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, and what happened to her? She was healed. And she came and fell at his feet. Fell at his feet. Where did we see that before? Jairus fell at his feet. And trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. And we're going to see why she probably feared telling him the story. And of course, a lot of times when Jesus performs miracles, the people around or who have the miracle performed on them, the word is translated fear, this awe, this reverence, this respect. And yes, fear. What did it say how the disciples felt when Jesus said, "Peace, be still," and the storm calmed down? It said they were afraid. So here she is, all this stuff going inside her, and a little bit of backstory, all the way back to in the Hebrew scriptures in the Old Testament. We're going to see what was just going on inside this woman's heart and in her head, and why she might be trembling with fear, telling him the whole truth. So she told the story that she had an issue of blood, a hemorrhage for 12 years. And that puts her in a certain category of people that some might call untouchable. And yet here she reaches out and touches Jesus. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you." I'm going to bring out a few little things that as I read a text, things that jump out, and it's not like there are a lot of answers as to why, but it gets one thinking. So we already have a second person falling at the feet of Jesus, and now we have this word daughter used a second time. When was the first time it was used? Jairus said, "My little," and I'm going to insert precious. It's kind of the feeling you get. This little isn't just talking about a small child. We're going to see that she was 12 years old. 12. Interesting. How long had this woman been dealing with this hemorrhaging of blood? 12 years. I think I'll name my sermon 12. Daughter. Jairus said, this term of endearment, my little precious daughter is dying. And here Jesus uses this word, daughter. It's a term of endearment. It's a term of familial inclusion, isn't it? Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. These two individuals, the woman and Jairus, need to get to Jesus. A woman who's in the crowd who really shouldn't have been there in the first place. I can just imagine kind of her, kind of maybe low, maybe slinking a little bit, certainly in secret, trying to get close to Jesus. And if Jesus is being kind of touched from all sides because of the large crowd, you can imagine that this woman too is probably getting bumped, and she's certainly touching other people just to get to Jesus. She needs to get to Jesus, but so does Jairus. He needs to get to Jesus because Jesus can do something that they cannot do for themselves. Call it desperation, last-ditch effort, going all in, all the chips on the table, no matter what, I don't care what happens, I've got to get to Jesus. Or call it faith. They had to have some level of faith or belief that Jesus could do what was necessary to restore health and wholeness. Did they believe in Jesus? And kind of in the way that we say, do you believe in Jesus, that he is the Son of God? Did they believe that he was the Messiah, that he was the perfect revelation of the Father? I don't know. That he was God in human form? Or did they believe in the miracles? Or was it hope against hope? that Jesus would perform one of these miraculous healings for them, for Jairus' daughter? Did they believe in the miracles, the story of healings he had performed? Maybe they didn't know what to believe about Jesus. Maybe the Spirit moved them to a place of deep faith. Whatever it was, they were moved to action, weren't they? They were moved to action. If you want to know what you really believe, look at how you live, how you behave, how you treat others. What does James say? Faith without works, faith without action is dead. It's one thing to say, I believe. Last week we watched Shrek. Henry was here and his movie pick was Shrek. And what song do they sing at the end? I believe, I believe, I believe it. And then I believe. We all have beliefs. But faith is as much action as it is belief. They put their faith in action and did something that was risky. They both risked something. Faith is a surrender as well. And the two of them, in a sense, surrendered what had come to define them. For the woman, she surrendered the shame and the stigma and the guilt, her identity as an outcast. She surrendered that. She let it go and moved into action. And Jairus, the synagogue leader, surrendered title and prestige and authority and worrying about what others would think of him. Surrendering what I think, sometimes we hold on to stuff. We have faith in our things or faith in what we can do, but real faith is surrendering what I think those things can do for me. Now about this woman. Next slide. This is Numbers 5. Numbers 5. Part of the Hebrew scriptures, part of the law, these purity codes that were still in effect to a great extent at this time of Jesus. The Lord said to Moses, command the Israelites to send away from the camp. And it's not, when we say camp, it's not just a few tents around a campfire, people roasting marshmallows. This camp is the community. This camp is the nation of Israel, this large, huge group of people who have just left Egypt. Command the Israelites to send away from the camp anyone who has a defiling skin disease or a discharge of any kind, or who is ceremonially, say that fast 3 times, ceremonially unclean because of a dead body. This is mind-blowing, because in this one sentence, it encapsulates what's going on in this story with these two people. And how Jesus inserts himself in the story. But first for the woman, send away any male and female alike, send them outside the camp so that they will not defile their camp where I dwell among them. The Israelites did so, they sent them outside the camp. They did just as the Lord had instructed Moses. Now moving on to Leviticus 15. When a woman has her regular flow of blood, the impurity of her monthly period will last 7 days, and anyone who touches her will be unclean until evening. Thankfully, that was a long time ago. When a woman was considered unclean during that certain time of month. Anything she lies on during her period will be unclean, and anything she sits on will be unclean. And anyone who touches her bed will be unclean. They must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean until the evening. Anyone who touches anything she sits on will be unclean. They must wash their clothes and bathe with water. And it goes on and on and on. Next slide. When a woman has a discharge of blood for many days at a time, other than her monthly period, or has a discharge that continues beyond that, she will be unclean as long as she has that discharge, just as in the days of her period. Now, some of the reading I did, in the way the word is translated in this story in Mark, it's not 100% sure whether or not it was an extended menstrual cycle or it was a hemorrhaging of blood. Either way, it made her unclean. And until that stops and she goes through a ritualistic cleansing, she is unclean. Cast outside the camp. How long was that for? Does anybody remember? 12 years. 12 years. 12 years she had this hemorrhage, this issue of blood. So how long is she unclean? 12 years. How long is she outside of her community? 12 years. Some of the reading I did is that somebody with this or something like this, they're relegated to their room, one room. But in the ancient Near East homes, it's not like this, where you could just quarantine in one room. Most of the rooms were communal rooms. So I don't want to make stuff up, but I can't imagine she had much contact with very many people. She was not a part of the normal social religious structure. Now, a lot of this uncleanness really has to do with the temple, with going to the temple and offering a sacrifice. Because it did say, God told Moses because he didn't want the uncleanness in the camp where he dwelt. And now we know in the time of Jesus, God's dwelling place was the temple. So it really had mostly to do with the temple. But I am sure that some of these restrictions filter down to just everyday life. You know how we do as humans. You know, if you can't do this or this is a no-no, that's not enough. Then this becomes a no-no, this becomes a no-no, this becomes a no-no. If you're unclean here because of this, and that makes you unclean, you know, that I don't really want to have any part of that. So now you're cast out of here. You're unclean here and here and here and here. I would imagine she did not have much contact with people. Any bed she lies on while her discharge continues, her hemorrhaging, will be unclean as her bed during her monthly period, and anything she sits on will be unclean. Anyone who touches them will be unclean. If I was unclean and I came over here and did this, and then David got up, go ahead. Oh, I'm touching a candle. Sorry, Zoomers. Zoomers. Oh, lovely Zoomers. I left the music stand in my notes. I'm just riffing here. Free flow, freestyle. And I touched the candle, and I said, if I was unclean and I touched something, somebody else comes along and touches that, and I'm unclean, cootie transfer. I don't want to minimize it because it's way deeper and more significant than that. It's not just, oh, I better go wash my hands. Mark has a cold. He just wiped his nose and touched the candle. Now David touched the candle. Oh, David should wash his hands. Maybe I should wash my hands before I touch the candle. But I think you know what I'm getting at. Anything that an unclean person touches then becomes unclean. Anything that an unclean person touches becomes unclean. Did the woman touch something? Yes. The cloak, the clothing of Jesus. Now, who else is unclean? Technically. Yeah, technically. Thank you for saying that. He's going to blow this whole thing up. I mean, he already has. Earlier in the story of Mark, and we're only in chapter 5, but he's already healed the leper. And how did he heal the leper? He touched him. Anyone who has a disease of the skin is unclean. And Jesus touches the leper, and he's healed. Oh, no. Jesus probably healed him before he touched him. Well, very, very well could have, right? But I don't think that's the point. Oh, it's possible. Jesus can heal without touching. But as I read, there's a lot of touching going on in this Mark text. And there's a lot of physical contact. There's a lot of touching as well before this story. And there's a lot after. This idea of Jesus with touch, this action of inclusion, this action of acceptance. I mean, you can imagine Jesus, okay, I'll heal you, leper, but, from way over there. No, he touched the leper. We're going to see that he touches Jairus' dead daughter, and that this individual, this woman, touches Jesus. Anyone who touches them will be unclean, and they must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean till evening. When she is cleansed from her discharge, she must count off 7 days, and after that she will be ceremonially clean. But it wasn't just 7 days, was it? It was 12 years. The woman's status as unclean alienates her physically from her family and friends. Other people need to avoid contact with her clothing, the places that she sits and sleeps. So isn't it just easier to have her go away? And yet here she is, part of a crowd of people pressing in on Jesus. Her presence is an act of civil disobedience. I can imagine some of the people in the crowd knew who she was. Maybe not. Maybe she had been outside the camp or the village or living somewhere else away from people that they didn't recognize her. She didn't know. They didn't know who she was. But again, it doesn't matter. She puts aside all of what we just read in Numbers and Leviticus and says, I need Jesus. There's an irony in this miracle story. The unclean woman interrupts a person who represents her exclusion. She interrupts a person, Jairus, a synagogue leader, who upholds the purity laws, the rituals, the law and the covenant, the religious structure. The unclean woman interrupts a person, right? Where is Jesus headed? Who got to him first? Jairus got to him first. Jesus agrees to go with him, and they're on the way to the house of this synagogue leader. And here this woman comes onto the scene. She's trying to do it discreetly, surreptitiously, secretly, clandestinely, stealthily, whatever word you want to use. But Jesus makes it a point to call her out. I think that's fascinating. Because he heals her in front of all of these people. Now, there's a large crowd around, and they're pressing in. And this woman tells her story. Do you think Jesus is the only one who heard it? No. And he calls her daughter. Go in peace. Be free from your suffering. This is the woman who interrupts the person who represents her exclusion, Jairus, a leader of the synagogue. On the way to his home, where his daughter teeters on the edge of sickness and death, Jairus observes the healing consequences of this woman's rebellious reach. And he may be torn. This woman is holding up Jesus, who's coming to my house to heal my daughter. Who does this woman think she is? And yet, she is healed. Which, aside from his perhaps high indignation, is a bit of comfort. I'm on the right track. I called the right guy, Jesus. He observes the healing consequences of this woman's rebellious reach, bodily wholeness for this woman, emotional security, reinstatement back into the community. The creative forces of justice place her transformation on display, disrupting power dynamics and defying the logic of superiority. Jairus didn't say, he could have, I guess, as a synagogue leader, just said, away with you. But because of her boldness, her faith, her touch of Jesus, the young clean woman claims dignity, wholeness, and a future. All in the presence of this religious elite, of this synagogue leader. Jesus, again, doesn't choose sides. On one hand, you have the oppressed, the kicked out of the community because of religious rules. If Jesus was going to pick sides, if we were of that mind, right? Already we have, if you lump them together, generalization, and we shouldn't do that. But a synagogue leader, religious leader, religious leaders, they've already plotted to kill Jesus. They keep coming after him and after him and after him. And here we have this woman who has been cast out. She's oppressed. She's downtrodden. Which side is Jesus going to choose? Well, we know, because we've seen it already. The downtrodden and others socially ostracized. The people that we typically see Jesus in the midst of, having a heart for, helping and healing, are lepers who themselves are outcast, cast out of the community until they are healed. Later on, a Samaritan woman. We don't mix with Samaritans. A tax collector. And of course, later on, a woman caught in adultery. Jesus mingling and mixing with those on the other side. Jesus doesn't choose sides. We have this oppressed woman and this man who represents those who would cast stones, exclude people from the community due to strict religious rules. Does Jesus choose sides? Or is his touch for everyone and anyone? While Jesus was still speaking, next slide, Some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. Your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore? Right? Jesus was going to come and heal this sick and dying girl. But she has just now died. Don't bother the teacher anymore. Overhearing what they said, Jesus told Jairus, don't be afraid. Just believe. Trust. Believe what you just saw with the healing of this woman. Believe. Have faith. Jairus is about to learn that Jesus loves all of the Father's daughters. This woman who Jesus calls daughter was an outcast, untouchable for 12 years. That daughter. And his very own little precious daughter. You can imagine the angst, the impatience, maybe even the impertinence that Jesus was wasting his time with this woman when time was of the essence for his daughter. And it came to pass. The worst news was delivered. It was too late. But time is not an obstacle for Jesus' purposes. We're going to see that he raises Jairus, his daughter, to life. Mark includes the detail that this little girl was only 12 years old. We're not there yet. I'm kind of getting ahead of the story. Mark includes the important detail that this little girl was only 12 years old. And that's an important Jewish number that bookends the story of the woman who had a condition for 12 years and a little girl who has only lived for 12 years. One writer says that the number 12 is a communal number. And it is. The numbers in the Bible do have significance. And they're used a lot to remind people of stories in history and past. They are significant. The number 12, it's a reference to the 12 tribes of Israel. How many disciples were there? 12. And you know it's a significant number because after Judas betrays Jesus and hangs himself, the disciples didn't say, 11's enough. No, they wanted another one. The number 12 also represents the number of completeness. But it's also a reference to authority and a perfect governmental foundation. It's interesting that it's a number of completeness. Jesus makes whole, completes this woman who had this issue for 12 years, and he brings back to life, brings back to completeness, back to community, a communal number, both of these daughters. And what does Jesus do with his authority? If 12 is a representation of authority, what does Jesus do with his authority? He restores the woman back to community and the little girl to her familial community, to her father and mother. We're going to see that these two daughters, in the state that Jesus finds them in, were cut off from the community. The number 12 is also a representation of the nation of Israel itself, 12 tribes. But in Jesus, no one is cut off. No one is cut off. Jairus was just told that his daughter was dead. Jesus doesn't say, well, I'll pray for you. I'll even perform the funeral, but it's too late. He doesn't say that. Don't be afraid, just believe. And they go to his house. Remember, Jairus said, all you need to do, all I need for you to do is to touch her. Is that what it says? You don't have to go there, Matthew. I'm going to look. Is that what it says? Where's my page 1? My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her. Come, touch her. Just put your hands on her. But she's dead. Jesus is still going. There's another situation here that makes this whole scene unclean. Next slide. Numbers 19. Actually, Leviticus 15:31 says you must keep the Israelites separate from the things that make them unclean, so they will not die in their uncleanness for defiling my dwelling place, which is among them. Keep the Israelites separate from things that make them unclean. Somebody with a skin disease, somebody with a hemorrhage of blood, somebody who has touched a dead person. In Numbers 19:11, it says, whoever touches a human corpse will be unclean for 7 days. The news has come that the daughter has died. Anybody who touches her is now unclean. In verse 14, this is the law that applies when a person dies in a tent. Now, back when the Israelites were fleeing Egypt and they had to stop and camp for the night, they had tents. I'm sure the same law or rule applies, whether it's a tent or a house. This is the law that applies when a person dies inside. Anyone who enters the tent and anyone who is in it will be unclean for 7 days. Next slide. And so there's a whole lot more to this, and you can read it in Numbers, but the way this is cleaned up and made clean again, there's a man who is ceremonially clean is to take some hyssop, dip it in the water, sprinkle the tent with all the furnishings and all the people who were there. We're going to see that it's just not the daughter and her mother and one or two other people. There's quite a lot of people here. Because that's what happens, right? When you know someone is on their deathbed, when life is slipping away, you call in the family. And here in the Jewish tradition, there were actually individuals who were professional mourners who came around to aid and I guess you could say grief counselors, or they would be a part of the family's journey through the grieving process. Even poor people were afforded at least 2 of these professional mourners back in the day. We're going to see in the text here in a little bit that the house was probably full, and they would all be unclean. He must sprinkle anyone who has touched a human bone or a grave, or anyone who has been killed, or anyone who has died a natural death. But if those who are unclean do not purify themselves, they must be cut off from the community because they have defiled the sanctuary of the Lord. And then Numbers 19 ends this way, and it's pretty intense. Anything that an unclean person touches becomes unclean. So that candle, because I'm unclean, well, no, I'm clean, but for example purposes, if I'm unclean and I touch that candle, anything that an unclean person touches becomes unclean. The candle is unclean. And anyone who touches it becomes unclean until evening. This is a big deal back then. You couldn't present yourself to the priest. You can't go to the temple. You're temporarily outside of this religious community, this social community. And those who come into contact with people who are unclean typically can go through the ritualistic cleansing, and they're only unclean for the rest of the day. For others, it's 7 days, and they're out. And we see that for this woman, it was 12 years. Next slide. We're at the end of our text, and we'll wrap up. Jesus did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the home of the synagogue leader, this is Jesus. He knows the girl is dead. He knows that as soon as he enters the house and touches her, comes into contact, and you don't know, Jesus coming in, he doesn't know if the mother touched the poor dead girl and then touched a lot of things in the house, and if Jesus goes in and touches things in that, this is not what's on his mind. He did not let anyone follow him. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. So there's already a lot of people there. So we know that this girl was on her deathbed, that she was so sick that they knew she was going to die. Jairus says, my girl is sick and she's dying. And the professional mourners are already there. He went in and said to them, why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep. But they laughed at him. They knew she was dead. They saw her die. We don't know how long she had been sick, but apparently long enough to know that the professional mourners were already there, and after he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand. What do you have to do to take somebody by the hand? Touch. Here's Jesus, who knows all the rules and he knows the laws better than anyone. And he touches this girl. Took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha Kaum, which means little girl, daughter, I say to you, get up. Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this. Like, that's going to happen. As soon as the girl walks out of the house, everybody's going to know. And told them to give her something to eat. You remember Jesus, to prove to the disciples that he wasn't just some ghost or apparition, asked his disciples, remember after his resurrection when he appeared to them in the locked room, he asked, do you have anything to eat? It's like, this is the proof that this isn't some parlor trick, this isn't some ghost or apparition, this is a real person come back to life. Give them something to eat. Catherine Laser writes, the woman with the flow of blood is supposed to avoid all human contact. She has no business reaching through the press of bodies to grasp Jesus' cloak. Yet she pushes through, stretching out her arms as he passes by. She is healed where she stands. Jairus is an upstanding man. He embodies the cultural, religious, and social norms of his village. He embodies the belief of the community and the keeping of the Hebrew scriptures, the law, and the covenant. Yet he throws himself, he kneels before this itinerant preacher and healer, this troublemaker. Actually, I included that part. This troublemaker. Because remember, he's already been called a blasphemer because he said to someone, you're forgiven of your sins, and the religious leader said, you're blaspheming. So he's a blasphemer. He eats with sinners and tax collectors. He doesn't fast when he should. The religious leaders say, Jesus, why aren't you and your disciples fasting like we are and John the Baptist's disciples? There was only one commanded time for the Jewish people to fast, and that's on the Day of Atonement. But there were other instituted periods of fasting. And this was probably one of those times when Jesus was questioned, well, why aren't you fasting? He didn't fast when he should. He breaks the Sabbath. They say he's in league with the devil, and here you have Jairus, who's an upstanding man, throwing himself at this kind of a person's feet. They're both flaunting tradition, the rules. The woman is healed where she stands because of Jairus' faith. His daughter is healed where she lays. These people are boundary crossers, just as Jesus is. He's willing to bend the rules, Catherine Laser continues. He's willing to bend the rules, and so are they. He goes against convention for the sake of the kingdom. He flouts the purity code and brushes aside distinction of gender and class and status. But so do most of the nameless men and women who come begging for his help. It's interesting, Jesus sees people, and in particular these two individuals, as individuals, and says precisely what they need to hear. Daughter, go in peace, he says to the woman. And this phrase, daughter, is an incredible phrase of inclusion, and you're a part of the family again. You're a part of the community. Daughter, go in peace. And to Jairus, he says, don't be afraid, just believe. He sees us as individuals. He knows precisely what to say to us. He knows what we're going through. For 12 years, this little girl lived, perhaps a privileged life, in the home of a respected local official. But status and privilege have not protected her from death, protected the family from death, the ultimate enemy. At the opposite end of the social scale is the woman in the crowd. If she had not had this affliction, she might have had a child now, just at the age of Jairus' daughter. 12 years of privileged childhood in one case, 12 years of outcast, childless poverty in the other. Both are far beyond human help. But one Jesus heals, and the other he raises from the dead. I like how these two stories come together to demonstrate the high value Jesus places on the lives of women, both adults and children. The woman was all but dead to those around her, and Jairus' daughter was dead. One approaches secretly, the other openly. One comes seeking healing and dignity. One comes seeking healing for another and casts his dignity aside. One has a reputation to lose. The other has nothing to lose. One is a permanent fixture in the community. The other is a permanent outcast. Jesus touches, heals, restores to wholeness, reinstates into community, and brings back to life. Jesus says to the woman, "Daughter, my child, go in peace and be free to live." Jesus says to Jairus, "Your daughter, your child, lives." May we allow Jesus to touch us, believing that we are not untouchable. May we live in the love, the healing and the wholeness, the dignity and respect that Jesus extends to us as daughters and sons, beloved children of God. And may we extend that dignity and respect to others. And may we touch the world around us with the love and the acceptance of Jesus.